The roar of an engine cut through the stillness of the lake, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. Jack Reynolds bolted upright in his chair, spilling his coffee all over his flannel shirt. He sprinted out to his back deck, heart pounding, only to find a group of hired workers hacking apart his beloved dock. His dock, the same one he had built with his own 2 hands. The same one where his father had taught him how to fish when he was a boy. And now, these strangers were smashing it to pieces like it was nothing more than a pile of driftwood. What the hell do you think you're doing? Jack bellowed, rushing down toward the water. One of the workers, a wiry man in an orange vest, barely looked up as he said, "HOA orders. This dock's gotta go." Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. "By whose authority?" "HOA president's," the man replied, gesturing toward the top of the hill. And there he was, Eugene Whitaker, in all his smug, khaki-wearing, golf-playing glory. Arms crossed, sunglasses gleaming. He looked down to destruction like some medieval lord overseeing the demolition of a peasant shack. Jack stormed up the hill, fists clenched at his sides. "Eugene, you better have one hell of a reason for this." Eugene sighed, like a man burdened by the sheer inconvenience of other people's emotions. "Jack, your dock violates community guidelines. It's unsightly and, frankly, it lowers the property value of the homes around you." Jack let out a sharp laugh, disbelieving. "Unsightly? You mean like that monstrosity you call yachtsing over there?" Eugene's yacht, a 35-foot luxury boat that looked more suited for a billionaire's vacation than a neighborhood lake, was parked in the community access dock, taking up more space than 3 regular boats combined. The hypocrisy was staggering. "That," Eugene said, adjusting his sunglasses, "is a community amenity." Jack shook his head, trying to suppress the urge to knock the glasses right off Eugene's face. "You're telling me my small, personal dock is against the rules, but your floating mansion isn't?" Eugene smiled, the kind of smile that made Jack want to throw him into the lake. "I don't make the rules, Jack. I just enforce them." Jack turned back toward the water, just in time to see the last of his dock collapse into the lake with a sickening crack. His boat, now unmoored, drifted slightly, bobbing like a lost puppy. His hands curled into fists. He could feel the heat creeping up his neck, the pure rage coiling in his chest like a snake ready to strike. But he didn't. Not yet, because Jack wasn't a man who struck in anger. He was a man who planned. The HOA had taken his dock. Fine, but they had made one fatal mistake. They had left Eugene's yacht untouched. The thought crept into Jack's mind, uninvited but impossible to ignore. He had the skills. He had the knowledge. And most importantly, he had the perfect target. That night, he sat on his porch, watching Eugene's yacht, a beer sweating in his hand. The gears turned in his head. He'd spent years working as a naval mechanic. He knew boats inside and out. He knew how they worked. And more importantly, how to make them stop working. But no, stopping Eugene's boat wasn't enough. That was petty. Jack needed something better. Something poetic. Something that would make Eugene feel the same gut punch of helplessness Jack had felt watching his dock get destroyed. And then, like a lightning strike, the idea hit him. What if Eugene's yacht just happened to go on a little trip of its own? Jack grinned to himself. The first genuine smile he'd had all day. He had some work to do. The next morning, Jack attended the HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back as Eugene droned on about protecting the community's aesthetic. Jack barely heard a word. He was too busy studying Eugene, watching the way the other board members deferred to him, nodding along as if they weren't all under his thumb. It was laughable. Jack had seen this kind of power play before, self-important men mistaking their tiny kingdoms for empires. "Any concerns from the community?" Eugene asked, looking around the room like a man who already knew no one would dare challenge him. Jack leaned forward. "Yeah, I've got one." Eugene's eyes narrowed slightly. "Go ahead, Jack." Jack laced his fingers together, keeping his expression neutral. "Just curious, what happens when someone violates the HOA rules?" Eugene tilted his head slightly. "Depends on the violation." "What if," Jack continued, pretending to think, "someone was using community space for personal gain?" A few board members shifted in their seats. Eugene's jaw tightened. "We would address it appropriately." Jack nodded. "Good to know." And with that, he leaned back content, because Eugene had no idea what was coming for him. That night, Jack got to work. His plan was simple, elegant, and just a little bit genius. Eugene's yacht was docked at the community access area, secured with heavy-duty lines. Jack had spent years working with engines, and he knew just how to rig a system that would allow him to tow the yacht out without making a sound. Using a small battery-powered winch and a little creativity, Jack set up a remote towing system that would guide Eugene's yacht out onto the lake, farther and farther, until it was nothing but a tiny in the darkness. And the best part? He wouldn't even need to be on the boat to do it. As he made his final adjustments, he glanced back toward the neighborhood. Somewhere in one of those houses, Eugene was probably sitting in his air-conditioned living room, sipping an overpriced scotch, completely unaware that his yacht was about to take a little unplanned voyage. Jack exhaled, stretching his fingers, feeling the electric thrill of what he was about to do. By morning, Eugene Whitaker was going to wake up to a very unpleasant surprise. And Jack was going to sleep like a baby. Jack sat on his porch as the lake stretched before him, calm and endless under the moonlight. Eugene's yacht bobbed gently in the community dock, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the HOA's hypocrisy. The man had taken away Jack's dock, claimed it was an eyesore, but there sat his massive boat, untouched, immune to the very rules he enforced on others. Jack took a long sip of his beer and smiled. Not for long. Jack had spent the past few days preparing, scouting Eugene's patterns, learning his habits like a fisherman studying his prey. Every Friday evening, Eugene took his yacht out onto the water for a short trip, often with a couple of HOA board members or a business associate. He'd drink his fancy bourbon, show off the boat, and return just before midnight. Then, like clockwork, he'd leave it docked in the same spot until Monday morning. It was the perfect window of opportunity. Jack's plan was simple but brilliant. Instead of damaging the yacht, which would make him an obvious suspect, he would let nature do the work for him. He had rigged a small, remote-controlled towing system using a modified motor with a pre-programmed route. It would slowly guide Eugene's yacht out into the lake, far beyond the usual boating lanes, where no one would find it for hours. With no GPS and no immediate way to steer it back, Eugene would be stranded in the middle of the lake, humiliated and helpless. And Jack, he'd be right at home, watching from a distance, enjoying every second of it. Friday night arrived, and Jack was ready. He waited in the shadows, watching as Eugene and his guests returned to the dock. Laughter echoed over the water, the sound of clinking glasses and drunken boasts filling the air. Eugene swaggered off the boat, slurring something about the privileges of leadership to his companions, who laughed a little too hard at his jokes. Jack clenched his jaw. The man reeked of entitlement. As soon as the dock was empty, Jack went to work, moving quickly but carefully. He attached a hidden towing mechanism to the yacht, securing it just below the waterline. He double-checked his setup, making sure everything was in place. Then, with one final glance at the sleeping neighborhood, he activated the system. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, silently, the yacht began to drift. The motor engaged just enough to create movement, but not enough to make noise. Inch by inch, it pulled away from the dock, slipping into the open water like a ghost in the night. Jack exhaled, a rush of exhilaration coursing through him. It was working. He watched as the yacht moved farther and farther away, its lights glowing softly in the darkness. Within minutes, it was completely unmoored, floating freely into the depths of the lake. Jack grinned. By the time Eugene realized what had happened, he'd be in for the surprise of his life. Jack turned to leave, satisfied, but then something caught his attention. Movement on the yacht. His heart stopped. That wasn't supposed to happen. A light flickered on inside the cabin, then another. Jack's stomach twisted. There was someone still on board. His mind raced. Eugene had left with his guests. He had seen them all disembark. But now, a muffled voice drifted over the water, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. A figure stepped onto the deck, silhouetted against the glow of the interior lights. Then another, and another. Jack's blood ran cold. It wasn't just one person. It was an entire group. The realization hit him like a freight train. The yacht wasn't empty. Eugene's wife, Linda, had invited her friends over for a late-night wine party. Jack cursed under his breath. This was bad. This was very bad. Linda and her friends, completely unaware that they were drifting into the middle of the lake, giggled and clinked glasses, toasting to something Jack couldn't hear. He needed to stop this before it got worse. He reached for the remote control, but then, disaster! A gust of wind pushed the yacht slightly off course, and in that moment, Linda noticed something was wrong. She frowned, stepping toward the railing. "Did we move?" she muttered. Jack held his breath. One of the other women, a little too deep into her third glass of Chardonnay, laughed. "Linda, honey, boats float. That's what they do." Linda didn't look convinced. She squinted toward the shore, then turned back to her friends. "No, I swear we were docked just a minute ago." The wind picked up again, and the yacht drifted even farther. Linda's face changed. "We're moving." One of her friends set her glass down. "Wait, what?" Jack's pulse pounded. He had to act fast. He could stop the motor, maybe try to reverse the whole thing before anyone panicked. But just as he reached the controls, Linda disappeared into the cabin. Seconds later, she reappeared with phone pressed to her ear. Jack closed his eyes. "Please don't call who I think you're calling." Then he heard it. "Hello, Coast Guard?" He groaned. Within minutes, the situation spiraled out of control. Linda, realizing that the yacht was completely adrift, began yelling at her friends to grab their phones. A few of them tried to drop the anchor, but by then, they were already too far from shore. Panic set in. The once cheerful wine party turned into chaos as more calls were made, voices rising in confusion and fear. Jack could only watch as the yacht, now illuminated in the darkness, became a beacon of distress. Then, in the distance, the wail of sirens. The Coast Guard was coming. Jack ducked low, heart racing. He hadn't planned for this. He needed to get out of sight before someone connected him to the scene. From his hiding spot, he saw the Coast Guard boat approach, its powerful searchlight cutting through the night. Officers called out, their voices sharp and commanding. Linda and her friends frantically waved, yelling about being lost at sea, despite being only a few miles from shore. Jack had to admit, if the situation weren't so dire, it would have been hilarious. The Coast Guard quickly secured the yacht, towing it back toward the dock. The commotion drew attention from the neighborhood, porch lights flickering on as curious residents gathered to see what was happening. Jack took a deep breath, retreating into the shadows. This was a disaster. Eugene was going to lose his mind. And worst of all, there was a very real chance someone might figure out Jack's involvement. As the Coast Guard finished their operation, Eugene finally arrived at the scene, still in his pajamas, shouting demands at the officers. His face turned redder by the second as Linda berated him for leaving them without checking the yacht. Jack couldn't hear everything, but he caught one golden moment. Linda jabbing a finger at Eugene's chest, yelling, "You and your stupid boat obsession almost got us killed." Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. At least something good came out of this. But the night wasn't over, because as Jack turned to slip away, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A single text message from an unknown number. "I know what you did." Jack froze, his stomach dropping. The game had just changed. Jack stared at the message on his phone, his heart hammering in his chest. The glow of the screen seemed to burn into his retinas, the words taunting him in the dark. "I know what you did." His mind raced. Who had sent it? Was it Linda? One of her friends? Someone from the neighborhood who had been watching from their porch? He swallowed hard, scanning the area around him. The lake was quiet now, the Coast Guard boat having already towed Eugene's yacht back to shore. Porch lights flickered across the neighborhood, silhouettes of nosy neighbors standing behind their windows, whispering, speculating. Someone knew, but how much did they know? Jack took a deep breath and forced himself to think logically. He couldn't panic. Panic got people caught. He needed to figure out what his next move was before this spiraled even further out of control. He typed a response. "Who is this?" He stared at the screen, waiting. The three dots appeared, then vanished, appeared again, then Nothing. No response. His fingers tightened around the phone. That wasn't a good sign. The next morning, Jack woke up to a fresh wave of chaos. The whole neighborhood was buzzing about what had happened. The HOA Facebook page was exploding with theories. Some thought it was an accident. Others speculated that Linda and her friends had taken the yacht for a drunken joyride and lost control. A few suggested sabotage, though no one had pointed fingers just yet. But the worst part? Eugene was livid. Jack watched from his porch as Eugene stormed around the dock, barking orders at HOA board members and questioning anyone who would listen. His face was red, his voice booming with rage. He was demanding an investigation, insisting that someone had intentionally set his boat adrift. Jack clenched his jaw. This was getting dangerous. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, Eugene turned his fury toward Linda. Jack could hear them arguing even from across the water. Eugene was blaming her for being careless, for not securing the boat properly. Linda wasn't having any of it. She was shouting back, pointing out how he never actually cared about her, only about his boat and his HOA power. The fight escalated fast, with HOA members awkwardly trying to pretend they weren't witnessing the marital breakdown of the century. Finally, Linda stormed off, leaving Eugene standing there, seething. Jack had to admit, if there was a silver lining to this disaster, it was that Eugene was getting exactly what he deserved. His perfect little kingdom was starting to crumble, and Jack wasn't the only one who had a reason to celebrate, but he still had a problem to deal with. That text message. Someone knew, and if they decided to come forward, Jack could be in serious trouble. That evening, he received another text. Meet me at the dock at midnight. Alone, Jack exhaled sharply. He had two choices. Ignore it and risk whoever this was going to Eugene with whatever they knew, or meet them and try to get ahead of it. He knew there was only one real option. So at midnight, he made his way down to the dock, heart pounding. The lake was still, the air thick with tension. He scanned the darkness, his ears straining for any sound. Then, a figure stepped out from behind a boat shed. Jack tensed, ready for anything. It was Linda. Jack blinked, completely caught off guard. Of all the people he expected, Eugene's wife was not one of them. She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. I know you did it, she said. You set Eugene's boat adrift. Jack stayed silent, weighing his options. He could deny it, but something told him she wasn't here to accuse him. If she was, she would have gone straight to Eugene. So, he decided on honesty. Yeah, he admitted. I did. Linda let out a slow breath. Then, she did something Jack didn't expect. She laughed. It wasn't a light chuckle. It was a full-blown, deep, satisfying laugh. Jack frowned, completely thrown. You think this is funny? He asked. She wiped at her eyes, still grinning. Oh, Jack! You have no idea how much I've been waiting for someone to take that arrogant idiot down a peg. Jack stared at her, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. But she wasn't lying. There was genuine relief in her face. So, you're not going to turn me in? He asked cautiously. Linda smirked. Turn you in? I want to help. Jack narrowed his eyes. Help with what? She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Eugene's been running the HOA like a dictator for years. He's been embezzling HOA funds, using them for personal expenses, including his precious yacht. I have proof. Emails, bank statements, everything. Jack felt his pulse quicken. Why haven't you exposed him before? She shrugged. Because I was stupid enough to think I still cared about this marriage. But last night, when he stood there blaming me instead of realizing what an absolute joke he's become, that was my wake-up call. Jack studied her for a long moment. If what she was saying was true, this was bigger than just a petty revenge scheme. This was a full-blown scandal waiting to explode. So what's the plan? He asked. Linda's grin widened. We take him down. The next day, everything started falling apart for Eugene. Linda leaked the emails to the HOA board. The proof of financial fraud spread like wildfire, and within hours, the community was in an uproar. Board members who once bowed to Eugene were suddenly turned their backs on him, terrified of being implicated. The HOA called an emergency meeting, and Eugene was blindsided when they voted to remove him as president, effective immediately. He tried to fight back, ranting about how he had done nothing wrong, but no one was listening. His reign was over. Jack watched the whole thing unfold with pure satisfaction. But the best part, the cherry on top, was that Linda was voted in as the new HOA president, and her first order of business? Undoing everything Eugene had done. Jack stood by the lake as workers rebuilt his dock, watching as the wooden planks were put back into place. Eugene, now powerless, could only glare from his porch, his face twisted in silent rage. Jack raised his beer in a mock toast, grinning. But he wasn't quite done yet. Later that evening, he made one last stop, Eugene's old yacht slip. The massive boat was gone, seized by the HOA as part of the financial investigation. In its place, Jack set up a small inflatable dinghy with a hand-painted sign tied to it. For HOA-approved boat storage only. The next morning, Eugene saw it. Jack knew because he heard the furious scream from all the way across the lake. Jack smiled to himself. Now, everything was exactly as it should be.